to Aloud at Central Library. It's great to see you here. I'm Maureen Moore, the Associate Director of the Aloud series. According to Freud, as Nick Flynn points out in his altogether inventive new memoir, The Reenactments, the compulsion to repeat the trauma, be it in art, nightmare, or waking life, can be healing, or it can be simply disastrous. Flynn's new book is a searing meditation on consciousness and grief, in which he reenacts the reenactment of his own family traumas, among them his father's homelessness, his mother's suicide. Flynn has the eerie experience of being both participant and observer of his own story, except in his case, Robert De Niro plays his father and Julianne Moore his mother. To amplify his tale, Flynn corrals a wide array of mentors and guides, from neuroscientist David Eagleman to Thoreau, to Walt Whitman, to his young daughter, who awakes with nightmares. Her daddy shows her how to change the movie in her head. "Why did you give me these eyes?" she asks her father as she drifts off. Nick Flynn is known as a master of the memoir form. In addition to the reenactments, his memoirs are The Ticking is the Bomb and Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, which won the Penn Martha Albrand Award and was the basis for the film Being Flynn, starring, yes you know, Robert De Niro, Julianne Moore, and Paul Dano as Flynn himself. The real Nick Flynn is also a prize-winning poet who has worked as a ship's captain, electrician, and caseworker for the working poor. He was an artistic collaborator on the documentary film Darwin's Nightmare, which won an Academy Award for Best Feature Documentary in 2006, and served as executive producer collaborator for Being Flynn. Here to discuss Being Flynn and the reenactments is the one and only Elvis Mitchell, host of The Treatment on KCRW 89.9. and film curator of the Film Independent at LACMA film series. Elvis has served as film critic at the New York Times, as entertainment critic for NPR's Weekend Edition, and as visiting lecturer at Harvard in Visual and Environmental Studies and African American Studies. Elvis will join Nick on stage following the reading. Let's both give them a warm welcome to Aloud at the LA Public Library.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to read a little bit. I'm just going to read for about 10 minutes from the book, just a few passages, and then Elvis and I will talk. And these are images. I want to share these images. These are images I took mostly while on stage, on set during the filming. So they're props for the most part. But then there's also a few images of flowers, and the flowers that you'll see are actually glass flowers from the Harvard collection of glass flowers, which is one of the panels of this book. It's a triptych. So there's these glass flowers, which I consider as another type of reenactment. And then there's a few family photos too, I guess. So I'll start the slides and I'll just read, and then Elvis and I will talk. And you can, if you have questions now, you can yell them out too before, if you want to, while we do this. All hushed, 7 of us huddle in a kitchen, stare into a monitor. It's about to start. The actress playing my mother stares back at us. She's in the middle of a living room. The room is just behind this wall, but I haven't gone into the living room, not yet. A set of headphones hangs from an empty chair with my name on them. Dan points to them, points to my head. It's only the 6th day of shooting. We're in a house in Queens. The owner rents it out at times for films like this, films that contain flashbacks to 1970s small-town America. This kitchen, paneling stamped to look like wood, avocado green refrigerator, seamless linoleum floor that looks like tiny bricks, is perfect. It's supposed to be my childhood home, but we will never step outside this house. Today and tomorrow are all interiors. After that, we will be gone. Julianne is soaking wet, having just failed to throw herself into the ocean. Or rather, having failed to keep herself under the waves after she did. You'll know this by the next scene, from the notes you will write. I know it already, having read the script, having written the book, having been there the first time around. We are meant to imagine that the ocean is near, walking distance, near enough for her to still be wet, which it was. Julianne stands there, waits, eyes downcast, looking toward the familiar carpet, a version of the wall-to-wall we once had. At action, she begins to sob or wail. I think of Saramago's blindness, how no one was there at the beginning of the universe, God's hands working the nothingness into the somethingness, yet everyone knows what happened. Another third of the book is these neuroscience, these books on how the brain and consciousness works. So we'll get to a little of that too. Dark polythene filters are being taped to the windows, making it night. The actor playing me when I'm 11, Liam Broggie, is sitting beside me on the couch. This looks nothing like my childhood home. We're between shots. This is how poor people live. The lights are being moved. Except I did have this awful white paneling in my bedroom. Yesterday, when we first met, Liam told me he wanted to be a writer. I was distracted by the mother, Julianne, who was standing a few feet away holding a basket of laundry. I hadn't spoken to her yet. I didn't know if I could. She was about to read my notebook, the words I wrote years ago, a story I was working on, which may or may not have set in motion her suicide. The notebook was hidden, misplaced, behind a pillow on the couch we are now sitting on. Liam asked me, "What do you have to do to become a writer?" I looked at him. Is this what people mean when they refer to their inner child? What do you have to do? You write. To be a writer, you have to write. My inner child, and what do I do? I snap, I bark, I'm short. Now I'm trying to make it up to him. I tell him I started out trying to write things that were like what I like to read. Mysteries, science fiction, horror. Philip K. Dick, Vonnegut, Poe. What do you read, I ask. The neurobiologist V.S. Ramachandran, in a brief tour of human consciousness, offers this. One common fallacy is to assume there's an image inside your eyeball, the optical image, exciting photoreceptors on your retina, and then that image is transmitted faithfully along a cable called the optic nerve and displayed on a screen called the visual cortex. This is obviously a logical fallacy because if you have an image displayed on a screen in the brain, then you have to have someone else in there watching that image, and that someone needs someone else in his head, and so on, ad infinitum. Now Paul, like some demented god, leans over Julianne, telling her what to write in her note. Then he takes me aside, asks me if there's anything she could write between the passage where she reads my notebook and the passage where she tells me she tried to throw herself into the ocean. This, I'm learning, is part of the reason I'm here, to fill in the white space hovering around the story of what happened. I take a page and write, I tried so hard, I wanted everything to be all right. Perfect, Paul says. If you have an image displayed on a screen in the brain, then you have to have someone else in there watching that image, and that someone needs someone else in his head, and so on, ad infinitum. And what happens when the images in your head begin to move, first in your dreams, then inside your waking, and then she is standing right in front of you, impossibly again? What happens when she begins to speak the words you wrote for her to speak, the words that were spoken to you, that you transcribed? What happens when you can sit on the couch in your childhood home and speak to your childhood self, and all you want to do is warn him not to write a word, even though you know it will be impossible to stop him? I like that people laugh. It makes me feel like I'm in Boston. When an arm, and I mean that in the best way, by the way. Are you from Boston? No? Okay. When an arm or leg is amputated, the patient often continues to vividly feel the presence of the missing limb as a phantom limb. Most patients with phantom arms feel they can move their phantoms, but in many, the phantom is fixed or paralyzed, often in a cramped position that is excruciatingly painful. According to Ramachandran, every time the patient attempts to move this paralyzed limb, he or she receives sensory feedback that the limb isn't moving. This feedback stamps itself into the brain circuitry so that even though the limb is no longer present, the brain has learned that the limb is paralyzed. Phantom limb pain is pain someone feels over something that is no longer there. The one way, the only way so far we found to relieve this pain is through a resurrection. You step into a mirrored box, which makes it look like your missing arm has come back. The mind has had such a hard time understanding. The arm, my fucking arm, is gone. It might never understand. But inside the box, the body is whole again, and the mind can understand. Once the mind sees the arm returned, resurrected, it can then slowly let it go. After 8 takes, it all dissolves. I look at the screen, and it isn't her at all. This isn't my house. There is no second chance. Nothing, no one is coming back. Where is my baseball glove, I ask her, and she answers sweetly, like she always does. If it was up your ass, you'd know where it was. Action. We're in the kitchen, holding our breath. I am writing these notes. I am in prison. I am making a movie of being in prison. The brain can contain anything in its own little hall of mirrors. We watched the way Julianne's mouth forms the words. I tried so hard, though really there's only one way to say snake, to say flower, to say gun. But we need someone to say it to us first, to point to the cage, to point to the sky, to say the word. Cut. I finally get to change out of these wet jeans, Julianne whispers as she passes by me. Without thinking, I reach out and hug her. This is the last piece I'll read. I have a friend, a writer, who, when she first heard me read from this book, could not understand the concept of the mirrored box. Afterward, try as I might, I could not explain the process to her, how it worked, how it tricked the brain into healing. All she could imagine was a mirror reflecting back the face of the sufferer. When she heard the word mirror, she saw her own face, and as I tried to describe it, she saw a hall of mirrors, where the whole body, along with the missing arm, was reflected back endlessly. Talking with her, I realized that a mirrored box could just as easily reflect a body with both arms gone, that the movie could go either way. For over 30 years now, my brother has had, apparently, no desire to meet our father. The years our father was living in the streets and in shelters, he had no desire to engage with him at all. Not that I had an overwhelming desire, he simply showed up at my work and didn't leave. Over the 7 weeks of the shoot, my brother comes to set a handful of times. Just because he has no desire to meet our father does not mean he has no desire to meet Robert De Niro. Where he is given his own chair before the monitor, his own set of headphones. Now he gets to see what it was like for our father to sleep outside. Now he gets to encounter our father sleeping out. But he does not come on our days with Julianne. Last night, Maeve is our daughter, 3-year-old. Last night, Maeve woke me up crying. I went to her bed to comfort her. Where are we, she asked. We're in your room, I told her. Everything's all right. Why is the movie so dark, she asked, staring up at the ceiling. Why is it so scary? The room did seem especially dark. Maybe there was no moon. I laid my head beside hers, looked at the ceiling with her. What's the movie, I asked. What do you see? A snake is biting my leg, she said, her voice rising again. Make it stop. I looked at the ceiling. Is it just one snake, I asked. Lots of snakes, but only one of them is biting me. Make it stop, she repeated. Can you change the movie, I asked. Can you tell the snake to stop? Can you make the snakes go back into their holes? Can you make the sun come up? Can you see any flowers? She was quiet for a moment, wide-eyed. It's a little lighter, she said. Any flowers? A few red flowers, she said. Any snakes? Snakes are all asleep now, she said softly. Maybe we can go back to sleep ourselves, I offered. Why did you give me these eyes, she asked as she drifted off. Thank you.
You know, it's hard to resist the impulse to call you Flynn after seeing the movie, because I think of you that way. But
That's okay, you can call me Flynn.
Okay,
Yeah.
as you're becoming Flynn out there.
Yeah.
One of the things, as I was reading the book a second time today, I found myself thinking about Ellison's introduction to the Invisible Man. You know, just fighting with monopolated power, and what did that do to be so black and blue? And then is that a text that meant something to you?
I haven't read it for a while, but it meant a lot to me when I read it. So you have to remind me about the introduction. Like, but I love the book. But
he's underground, and he's sort of like commenting on his own state of being lost from everything, being lost in this whole world that has no place for him, and trying to figure out that place and being aware of everything going on around him, which is so much of what happens here.
Yeah, yeah.
And also that kind of comedy. We're talking backstage, and I told you one of the things that really occurred to me as I was reading the Suck City. And I like the idea of saying another bullshit night in Suck City at the library. It just feels good. But that's that Brechtian kind of thing.
Yeah,
And you were talking about that a little bit too.
Yeah, we talked about that backstage a little bit. The Brecht thing. The thing about Brecht that is interesting to me is just the idea of actively, asking or forcing the audience to participate in the act of making meaning of the text of the book. That's the sort of art that I'm interested in. I'm not really so interested in something that you passively consume. I'm much more interested in art that somehow involves me and leaves. I leave a lot out. I leave a lot out in the book. I mean, I've written 3 memoirs, so it may sound strange that I leave out, but things, But I feel like within the memoirs, there's a lot of white space. There's a lot of space where one scene sort of like leaps to another, and there's this space in between. In that space is where like the reader is hopefully makes some meaning, or maybe not, or maybe the reader just goes to the refrigerator or something. But even that would be fine. That'd be a form of meaning. They're actively doing something.
Well, the thing that Brecht talked about is wanting to make the audience aware of their own participation. I mean, that sense of self-awareness that he brought to everything he did, that was part of the superstructure of the work, was key for him. And he wanted to do that just to sort of rouse people from what was going on during that time in Germany. And for you, I kind of feel like that same kind of thing. You want to wake people up to this kind of despair going on around that.
Well, I wouldn't say I want to wake people up to despair, just because that sounds that sounds kind of heavy.
Have you read your book?
Well, folks here, I mean, some people got the jokes here. I think the books are actually quite light. In a way, I try to write them in such a way that they sort of get carried along by more by the light than by the darkness, because darkness is. I don't have that much tolerance for that either. Like I wrote a book. The last book I wrote was called "The Picking Is the Bomb," and that was, on one level about state-sanctioned torture, through a meditation on the average photograph. But I don't, in the book I talk about the photographs, or I talk about torture like, some little sliver, 5% or something. It's not really like I don't like to dwell on that really. Like it's a reality. It's part of the reality. It's sort of the shadow that's sort of like propping up the reality. But you don't need to spend so much time on it because it's got such potent power. It's the same thing with something like suicide or with, homelessness. Like you don't really. There was a funny thing in the first book, in Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, when I sold it to Norton, and then I went away, and it took me years to finish the book. And I went to Europe I moved to Rome, just I think to get away from my editor, and then I just wouldn't answer her emails or anything. And because she'd say, like, where's the book? And
why weren't you answering the email?
Because I wasn't finishing the book. I hadn't finished the book. It took me 7 years to write the book. And I think I sold it to her after 3 years, and it took another 4 years, and I think she expected it sooner. And so my only solution was to leave the country. But at one point when I got the notes back, she's a wonderful editor. She's been the editor on all my books, Jill Bielowski. She's wonderful. But at one point she wrote back to me from the first draft I sent in. After about 30 pages, she wrote in the margin, said, "I'm getting a little tired of reading about the homeless." And the book was about, I'm like, well, the book's about my homeless father. Like, I don't know how else to do this. But I sort of got her message, because what it was is like it really is like a spice or something. It's like it can only take so much, like darkness. You can only fit so much darkness, and you need, and the world is, my world and the world I walk through is kind of full of light. It's not like, I don't like walk
Well,
with.
the reason I brought up Brecht, though, because Brecht laughed at all this stuff. I mean, you can't.
He
see,
laughed at it. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
I mean, because that was the point of it. If you try to pretend it's not there, then it's actually all the worse.
Yeah.
And you've got to find some humor in it. And despair to him was a funny thing.
I've
because
just broken my thing here.
we can do like a Mick Jagger, Keith Richards thing. You can talk into mine. I found myself thinking too about. I told you I reread A Song of Myself after reading this, and that line, "I laugh at what you think of as dissolution, and I know the amplitude of time."
Yeah. I'd recently read. I had such a hard time with Whitman for so long. It was very strange. I was more of a Dickinson. You know, like you have to choose between your mom and dad. You know, so I had always gone with Dickinson, and you know, just like her mystery and her sparseness and her like connection to some sort of a cosmos in a different way. Like you know, she's not as much of a blowhard either as Whitman. But then I read Robert Haas.
I can just leave now if you want.
No, but Robert Haas like wrote this book which I read a couple of years ago. He wrote that new you know, it's like a new translation of Whitman, you know, but he didn't translate it. He just somehow put it in context, and it was such a gorgeous book. And that's when it suddenly exploded open for me. I mean, you know, sometimes, I don't know how it is with other people, but sometimes it can be silly. You can hear that something's really great for years, and you sort of keep throwing yourself against it. And then finally, one day it opens up, and you're like, oh, I get it now.
But you have to be ready for it. And,
yeah, you have to be ready, yeah.
And he talks about that sense of grasp and ambition in Whitman, and whenever there are passages about your dad's writing, I mean, everybody's trying to write. There is that grasp and that sort of need for confession that he talked about. I talked about it in Whitman, and just again that line, "I laugh at what you think of the dissolution of time." I mean, that sounds like something that almost had to be a tattoo for you in some way.
Yeah. There's something about that I needed someone like Haas to sort of walk me through it. You know, somehow it's interesting. It happened with Rilke too. I was directed toward Rilke for years, and then finally I read it. I read the Duenya elegies out loud to a girlfriend, and then I got it. You know, like then I'm like, okay, now I get why Rilke's great.
And what did the girlfriend think of this?
It worked, yeah.
Because I just find myself thinking these situations where you're kind of backed into these corners in the book. The first day you're on the set and Paul White says to you, "So, anything else?" You kind of go, "Oh."
Yeah. My role on set wasn't clear to me. It wasn't a real clear thing. I was sort of the ghost presence on set, like that. You know, they sort of set a chair up, but it wasn't clear if I was supposed to go. They wouldn't send a car for me, but they would set a chair up. And so somehow I had to get to the chair every day. You know. So and then Paul would turn to me at the beginning. He turned to me and said, like, you know, you got anything? And it, like De Niro had just done a scene or something. I'm like, do I have anything? What do I have? I don't know what I have. Like, and what he meant was just some feedback. You know, obviously, you know, that became clear eventually, but I had no idea what he was talking about at first. And then I realized that there were these small things I could do on set, you know, which I talk about a little bit in the book. Just like there's a moment where at the end of the film, De Niro has now gotten off the streets and is back in an apartment. You know, my father was homeless for 5 years. The movie ends with getting him off the streets, and so he goes back into an apartment. And the props guy had on the table. You know, everyone was wonderful in the film. The props guys were excellent, but he had put De Niro's supposed to be sitting in the scene, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of vodka, drinking a bottle of vodka, which is, you know, he starts the film drinking vodka, he ends the film drinking vodka, which is, you know, why, you know, that's his redemption is that he gets better vodka at the end. But the props guy had put a bottle of nice whiskey like holding books up on his desk behind him, and I went in. I was just like, what's the whiskey doing there? Like you know, my father's not the kind of drinker that like has an extra bottle around for is that, you know, for company or something, you know, like it's not like, you know, like he drinks his bottle of vodka, he goes and buys another bottle of vodka. He's not like, you know, if there's a bottle of whiskey on the table, he drinks a bottle of whiskey. Like it's not like this was a nice dusty classic bottle of whiskey so we got rid of the bottle of whiskey. And that was my role. That was sort of what I could do. It was almost like little things like that was one of the things I.
Well, you're talking about that, and there's a kind of interest in detail and observation, almost decoding. Because I told you when I first read Suck City, it felt like a punk noir to me. I mean, that just going in and investigating a world and bringing us into it. And you even do it here by saying the first time you're sitting with Paul for lunch, a guy pulls up with a truck. and you know immediately that he's homeless.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just the way there's a little dirt around the pockets, and the way he's got the pants staple up in the back.
Yeah, yeah. That was the thing. A lot of like this, sort of the closer I get to myself, like I probably had the least thing to say about Paul Dano. Yeah, I think he did a great job. He did a fantastic job, I think, playing me. But I don't even know if I can say that.
What do you mean? Why can't you say?
Because I don't even know what I'm like. Like it's not like I have a sense like oh yeah, that's a really good me. Like, and that's part of the book too. The book is an examination of what it is to have a self and a consciousness and memory. Like those are all parts. That's part of what the book is an examination of. And so, you know, and part of being on set and seeing, like I go to set and there's a trailer. The first day on set, there's a trailer on the street parked in the East Village with a masking tape on the door with the name Nick Flynn written on it. But I realized, I think I tried to go in it, and I realized that's not for me. This is for Paul Dano. This is not my trailer. This is Paul Dano's trailer. And then so I can't go in the trailer with my name on it. Then there's another guy who's wearing a piece of masking tape on his thing that says Nick Flynn on it also. But he's not Paul Dano even. He's Paul Dano's body double. So when they're shooting a thing, so there's two Nick Flynns already, and then the young 11-year-old comes in one day, and then there's just this sort of multiplication of selves. So I don't know, but the things I did have control over or have a sense of was like how things worked in a homeless shelter and how things like the mechanics, the physics of a homeless shelter. Those are the things I felt I had some control over. The closer it got to maybe like the essence of who I am, whatever that is, or myself, the more diffuse it got, I think. It was harder for me. So, the scenes with Paul Dano in bed with a woman, I'm like, I had nothing to say those days. I was just like, yeah, you're fine. Yeah, just go at it.
That would have been a whole different kind of movie, I think. But I guess I found myself, like, again, when you take Paul Weitz on a tour, and at one point you're in an ATM with just sort of, and you're just reliving all this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there were moments, again, it's like, again, like in a detective novel, you're taking us into this world with you. Yeah. You do that in Suck City, and you do it again here. And that moment, we'll talk about that a little bit here. You
mean before we made the movie?
Yeah.
Paul and I went to, Paul and I, we worked on the film for 7 years before it started shooting. And Paul, when he was early in writing the script, he and I met in Boston. We met in Boston on a freezing cold night. I flew up from Texas and he flew in from LA, and we were both badly dressed for Boston. It was 5 degrees. And so we had to go into I knew from working at the shelter, we went to the shelter and ended up going out in the van that night, this van that goes and sees people on the streets, Paul and I, and we went out for 12 hours. We went out for 8 hours for the whole night. But so I went into the clothing room at the shelter, which I knew you could do, and we took big coats out and put on these coats. So instantly we put on these homeless coats. We instantly became homeless. Like, we sort of read as homeless. And at some point, so we're going around, and we just went to this one park in South Boston where the people we were working with on the van said a guy had been beaten to death. A homeless guy had been beaten to death by kids like 2 weeks earlier that they knew. And there was a homeless camp set up. And we went there and talked to the people there. And then we went to an ATM just up the street. And there was a guy in the ATM. And Paul and I went to the ATM, and the van was sort of gone. The van had sort of left to go do something else. And we were just with this guy in the ATM. We were sitting on the floor with him with our big coats on, and he's got his big coat and a big shopping cart. And these kids walked by, and they banged on the door of the ATM and said, like, kill the homeless faggots. And Paul and I were sitting there. We were sitting there realized, like, wow, like, how do we explain to them, like, we're not homeless faggots? Like, it was just this thing. Like, it was sort of this thing. You sort of looked like, and you sort of like, Paul and I looked at each other and like, yeah, we're in trouble. Like, this isn't good. Like, these are the kids that just killed a guy, and now here we look like homeless people. You got to tell them, like,
that you in Southie.
Yeah.
Really.
We're in Southie. Yeah, in Southie, which is, it's a nasty place. And what's Paul going to say? I mean, of course, a homeless person would say, like, I directed American Pie. I mean, of course he's going to say that. I mean, like, what do you?
That sounds so appropriate.
Yeah. Say. Like, you don't want to kill me. But fortunately, somehow it passed. The thing they went away, and Paul ended up putting that in the script of the film. And it was a really important moment actually for Paul and I, just because the thing is that the homeless feel like that they're the threat in some way, that they're the threat to society or something. But actually, from working with the homeless, it feels like they're much more vulnerable.
That's the point.
Yeah.
The great point you make there, and it's also a point that kind of goes in and out of Suck City, that constant sense of certainly being aware of your own vulnerability when you think that you're not.
Yeah.
But awareness to you, again, that's why I said detective novel, because there are all these stages of awareness that I think if you look at Murders in the Rue Morgue, for example, and that sort of sense of, wait a second, this is much worse than I think it is.
Yeah.
And
So you think of the awareness of just me being on set too?
yeah.
Yeah. There was that too. Yeah. There's certainly like there were certain moments like the passage I read about the day I went when Julianne's there. I mean, those were difficult days, and they were very it was psychic. There was there's certain psychic dissonance that was very palpable the day, even the days leading up to it, because I would get the script. You sort of know when Julianne's coming. You know that she's coming next week on Tuesday or something, and I had this sort of like strange excitement, like, oh, I get to see my mother again. And then you look at the script again, and oh, then she dies the next day. So there's like she's going to show up and then she's going to die, and that's the way movie time. And then the house you're in just it vanishes the day after that. It's just suddenly it's gone. You'll never see that house again ever, except in the editing room. So it's very strange. It's a very strange. The film, making a film, really does seem to mirror the process of memory in some way. Like you just get this moment, or even of life. It's a really strange thing. Like you think you have like many sort of moments to return to something, but you don't always. Sometimes that's the one take you get.
We're talking about that slipperiness of memory, even in the book, where you're talking about De Niro and seeing him in The Godfather Part 2, and your own version of that, and then going back and watching. Wait, that's not the way it went at all.
Yeah. A lot of the book is I try to sort of work out like I my process of writing is I try to write how I remember something, and then I'll go back and sort of see where I got it wrong. I'm sort of more interested in the mistakes, the slips of memory, where the memory slips and you get it wrong, because that sort of reveals some sort of something more about you as an individual, I think, rather than if I thought about De Niro in The Godfather and then immediately I went and sort of watched a clip of it, and then that would become my memory of it. But it's more interesting how I misremembered, whether the hat was black or white, or
it's
whether
filling in those white spaces you're talking about.
Yeah, the white spaces. Yeah.
I guess I'd like to the part where you take Paul to meet your father.
Yeah. Yes. Take Paul to meet him, or take De Niro to meet him?
De Niro, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he took Paul to meet him a few times, and Paul. My father is always he always sort of performs very well in front of Hollywood people. When he first met Paul like years ago, he ended up taking out this spiked club and like brandishing it to Paul's head, not threatening him exactly, but sort of showing that he was a tough guy, that he had this,
making his presence known,
that he could defend himself. Yeah, and it's a formidable looking club. It's an impressive thing with a big spike in it, which I now have. I took it from him because he was threatening people with it. So. But then he said like when I took it, he's like, fucking, I got like golf clubs for you. This is just like one thing, Yeah.
But the De Niro meeting is pretty funny.
Yeah. So De Niro wanted to meet him before the shoot began, and so we all like went up there, and I didn't. At this point, like in the course of making the movie, in the 7 years it took to make the movie, my father had gone downhill, and I actually had to move him out of his apartment that he'd been in for like 15 years into a long-term care facility. He was, he was decompensating, as they say, and so I didn't know I'm like, he's not the same guy he was when he was on the street. But De Niro really wanted to meet him, so we went up one day to Boston and went to the long-term care facility and walk in, and my father, who had met Paul years before, had pointed out to. And when we told my father that Paul was going to direct the movie, my father, the first thing he said was that only 2 people could play him. That he had already cast the movie because my father is a bit of a narcissist, and he said Dustin Hoffman or himself could play him, and that was about like 6 years ago. And so then we show up 6 years later, 6 years later with De Niro, and my father was not pleased. He was not impressed either, because he'd already said who should be cast, and it really was palpable. He was just like, "Who is this guy? Who is this?" Like, and then he just ignored De Niro for an hour and just rambled on about his life and about his exploits and about going to prison and about the books he'd written and all these things. And then finally he turned to De Niro. Finally, when I keep sort of trying to point out to him, like, this is Robert De Niro here. And finally just turned to De Niro and said, so you do a little acting? Which I think was good. I think, I'm not sure, but I think for an actor, I think that was sort of a good experience, just because I don't know if De Niro's been in a room with someone who is so underwhelmed by his presence in probably 40 years. Like, I think people act kind of strange around De Niro, but not my father didn't. So.
Well, I'm sorry. I just love that story so much. But I also like, too, I mean, just that the way you set the scene and go into your dad's place, you would take Paul to meet him.
Yeah.
Just the time it takes to find some place to sit and moving all this stuff around, and then.
Yeah, my father was a bit of a hoarder, yes. That was one of the reasons he was going to get evicted, besides threatening people with the spiked club, or drinking vodka all day long. Was that he would hoard, like, he considers himself to be the greatest writer America's yet produced, or one of the three greatest. With he didn't include Whitman somehow, but Mark Twain and J.D. Salinger and him.
I'm sorry.
So he had all the newspapers. He had all these newspapers that were very neatly stacked in his apartment. They were stacked, like, but on every surface they were stacked. And whenever he had to go in, his bed would be completely covered with newspapers stacked up, like, deep. And you have to move the newspapers to sit down. Like, yeah, it didn't smell good either. No, it didn't smell good. Yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of voluptuousness the way you describe things. The wet animal smell. I mean, you can taste that when you read that kind of thing.
No, yeah, I could taste it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you helped me to taste it too, I should say, Nick.
Yeah, but part of it is, it's like, part of the book is also just like what happens. It's a very common story in a sense too, because my father takes up a lot of this book also. Like, and it is sort of what a lot of us end up going through, is like, taking care of an aging parent. Like and what your role is, and how suddenly the tables are turned, and someone who is, when my father appeared at the shelter, I was like in my 20s, and I really felt in some way, psychic way, that he could destroy me. It was still that moment in my life where he was like in his late 50s, and he seemed somehow formidable.
Powerful, you say?
Yeah. He was 30 years older than me, and somehow he was, even though he was at this point in his life where he was homeless, but he wasn't even admitting to being homeless. He was denying it. He was just sort of saying, I'm just here, I'm here gathering material for my great novel,
But the way you describe him in Suck City is almost the way Chandler describes when he goes to meet his client for the first time. Mm-hmm. That sort of sense of, who am I in comparison to this, and sort of seeing himself mirrored in that. I mean, it really does feel like detective fiction.
Yeah, well, I read a little bit of detective fiction. I mean, I take that as a compliment. So, I remember there was the poet Alan Dugan. Alan Dugan, the poet. He I wrote a poem once. The first workshop I took with Alan Dugan, I wrote a poem, and it was just this outdoor thing he would have every week, and he read the poem, and he just read the poem, and he looks and he goes like, this poem reads like a cheap detective novel, and I got nothing to say about it. And he threw it down, and I was like, what's wrong with a cheap detective novel?
That's what I think. But you also are talking about generational things too. I'm glad, because when we were talking backstage, and I said you had to read that passage about your dog, you said, I've already got that marked.
Yeah.
Just because that thing of the eyes.
Yeah.
And to her basically creating her own narrative in her own way. It really does seem to be a thing that basically goes through your entire family. The idea of being aware of the narrative you're creating as you're living them.
Wow, I didn't. Wow, that's God help her. I didn't pick up on that. Like I thought it was more innocent than that. But yeah, maybe. I mean, shit. That's the trouble. And part of the whole book. I mean, this book is like the last of a trilogy, starting with Another Bullshit Night in Salt Lake City. It sort of, goes through the my mother and father, really, their trajectory, and mine, I guess. And it is about like just what it is to be a child of to have the same blood as certain people, and trying to understand that why one would maybe want to understand as much as one can about your parents, try to get something, even though I feel both my parents are completely inscrutable.
Still?
Yeah, oh yeah, in a way, yeah, sure. Like all the things that add up. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like the book, like Another Bullshit Night in Salt Lake City, never answers like the central question, like, why is your father homeless? You know, because I don't know why. Like, people do exactly the same things my father did. They're not
You know, when
homeless.
you read that book, though, you don't get that until you read it the second time, because you said
Yeah,
so vividly what
yeah,
this scene is,
yeah,
and it seems that we think you're going to answer that, but then you
yeah.
don't.
No, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Did
yeah.
you think about at some point putting that in, or did you have
Oh,
that in?
oh, yeah, 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 sure, sure. You know, that question, that's the central question. Also, why I never take him inside is another central question. And I can't, you know, none of those questions get answered because there is no answer for them, really. You know, why he's homeless, there's no answer.
I want to get back to this thing you're talking
Mm.
about, parents and children, your own relationship with your own daughter, because you're sitting with her and she's telling you about these movies that she's seeing in her room in the shadows.
She's projecting them from her eyes.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a
Her,
really,
her head is a projector.
which is almost
Yeah,
something out of Philip K. Dick here.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
really
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah,
And she's basically playing this out for you. And I couldn't help but think about, again, that sense of creating a narrative,
yeah.
which is a fascinating thing to do. Just to see, you must be interested as she's telling you these stories about where that's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like ridiculously interested in everything she says.
So you're a parent, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, I'm total stereotype. You know, yeah. I think everything she says is amazing. And but it does. I mean, you know, when she says she's like 3 years old and she's like staring at the wall, saying, "Do you see that? You know, I'm projecting. I'm making a movie on the wall." There was a whole thing for like a year. And maybe we can do that. Who knows? And maybe we just forget that we can do that when we get older. I don't know.
I mean, do you have a memory of creating those kinds of stories at a really early age for yourself?
No. No. She doesn't remember projecting movies now. I mean, she's
Oh,
5 now.
it's gone
No,
now.
it's gone. It's gone. Yeah.
Oh, and what kind of creative pursuit does she have now? I mean, does she?
What does she have now? There's tons of imaginative play with just the characters.
Because I love the stuff about Hot Pepper.
Hot Pepper, yes, yes. Hot Pepper's gone now. Yeah, we haven't heard from Hot Pepper for a while. No,
I
Hot Pepper's
love
gone. I know.
that.
I'm sorry. It's like this is it. Hot Pepper only exists in this book. Hot Pepper was her friend that was just with her all the time. Everything that happened was Hot Pepper did it. Like if there was something missing, like, oh, Hot Pepper took that, or if, you know, and where's Hot Pepper? Hot Pepper lives, you know, in France, and Hot Pepper listens to everything, can hear everything we're saying, and if there's any bad guy coming, Hot Pepper will come and take care of the bad guy. So Hot Pepper was a vivid character for a couple of years.
But Hot Pepper's the Paris is also visible from your house.
Yeah. Paris, yeah. Hot Pepper lived behind us in Brooklyn. Yeah, that was Paris. The apartment behind us was Paris. Yeah, Hot Pepper lives there. Yes. Yes.
But you're talking about movies and just this creation of movies and that whole Eagleman section about that incredible thing that he does, where we can sort of detect brain chemistry as we're watching movies. Right about.
Yeah, there's sort of 3 neuroscientists that I read most closely for the book. Ramachandran, who I talked about in the reading, Antonio Damasio, and David Eagleman. And David Eagleman and I got to do he was on stage here, I guess, a couple months ago. He and I are both in Houston. I teach in Houston in the spring semesters. And so we've gotten to become friends down there, and I go to his lab. I've been to his lab, and I'm trying to get him to hook me up to an fMRI machine that, you know, takes photographs of your brain. I want to watch the movie while my brain is, and then see what happens when I see, you know, Dano. I don't know. See if there's any. I don't know.
Well, you talk
It
about
might
that.
just be a nice picture. I don't know.
Yeah, but you talk about that in the book. You know, at a certain point, you just from the Flynn character.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not you. You find a way to sort of just describe it. It's not you anymore.
Yeah.
It's the Flynn character.
Yeah.
When did that happen for you? That you were able to detach and just sort of ascribe that thing to him?
Well, I think it had to. It's unsaid. It was just too confusing to say, like, you know, to say Nick and have 3 people turn. So you just sort of had to sort of realize that this isn't. They're never going to use my name. So it's always going to be, you know, it's always going to be referring to a character on set. So because that's the important thing at that moment. We're making a movie, so that's what you needed to, you know, focus on.
But that,
So.
I mean, and that backstage too, I told you how much I love the stuff about the phantom limb, and that particular passage where a mirror is held up to a body.
Yeah. That's you know, the stuff I was reading that it did seem like at a certain point I was taking notes on set. Like when I went to the set, I would take notes for because there's a lot of dead time on a set. Like when you're making a movie, as I'm sure all of you know, because you all live in Hollywood, there's a lot of dead time we're just moving the lights or moving the cameras or doing whatever they're doing. And so I brought notebooks. I filled up many notebooks on set. But then when I go home, in order for light reading, I started reading this brain stuff about neuroscience, which I thought would be not connected to this at all. But then they kept talking about the metaphors that the neuroscientists use were all about that consciousness is like, watching a movie, and that there's a movie in the brain, and that memory is this, is it a movie or is it a play? There's all these, they're using very filmic images. And so I realized that those books were talking to, were talking to this project also. And so it just sort of became, sort of naturally sort of came into this. And then Ramachandran, I came upon this thing of Ramachandran, who had invented the idea of the mirrored box, like that for a patient who was suffering from phantom limb syndrome, the only way to relieve it that he found, that anyone has found so far, is to put them in this box that he developed that makes the body whole again. So the body becomes, the patient sees their body because the good arm or the arm that remains is now reflected in the spot where the missing arm is. And so their body becomes whole again. And somehow by seeing that, somehow the brain can then accept that the arm is gone. It's a strange thing because usually probably with an amputation, it happens like when you're asleep, like there's an explosion, and then you wake up and your arm's gone. And the brain never sort of accepts it. Never, a lot of soldiers, it happens to soldiers a lot, obviously. And the brain just can never sort of comprehend that the arm is gone. And so the filming became to feel like that too, like that there's some sort of just a big mirrored box. And like bringing like Julianne back was like the equivalent of bringing the arm back. It started to, I started to think that like at times, like that was maybe the reason I was on set. I didn't talk about that on set much.
Did you not? Why not?
There was other concerns on set, and this is sort of my own little crazy talk. So.
No, but I mean, because obviously, and Paul told me about this, he wanted you there because he wanted to sort of convey that sense of figuring things out that you talk about in Suck City.
Yeah, but getting into like neuroscience, it didn't seem like there was like the space. I don't think. Like we were talking about the script, we were trying to get the shots done for the day, and I didn't think injecting like neuroscience into that conversation would have been productive.
Well,
like to suddenly sort of stop like in the middle of a shot and say, do you know what Ramachandran says about this?
Although the one person you could do that with would be Paul.
It would be Paul, yeah, it would have been Paul.
Because he would have that kind of interest. But speaking of the script, and we talked about this a bit backstage too. I remember how excited Paul was. He told me he was going to do this, and the first script, and you write about that a little bit in the reenactment.
Yeah, Paul. Paul and I met, and we mentioned that scene, the scene, the reality. Paul and I met for the first time at a restaurant in LA called Ammo. Probably you all ate there for lunch. I don't even know what Ammo is, but that's where we met.
Who is Ammo?
Ammo, yeah, Ammo. So we met there, and I saw this guy who was invisibly homeless behind us. We were talking, Paul and I. Then we went, a couple months later, or a month later, Paul and I met in Boston and did that whole thing in the van. And then Paul wrote the script, and I would go see him. I saw him a couple times. It took him a few months, 6 months or something, to write the script, I think. And I'd see him occasionally in LA, and I'd go to his studio, and he had an entire room set up that was just trying to map the book for him. He was trying to find his way into the book. And it was really fascinating. It really became like every time I'd go, I went several times to the room. It got crazier and crazier. It got like just filled with like Post-its and little signs and little thread connecting Post-its, and it began to look like the garage in a beautiful mind. It was like this. It was really, but he was really trying to find his way into the book. He was trying to find the map of the book, like there's this here, because there are in the book there are a lot of images that get repeated. Like it starts here, and then like later on in the book it gets with echoes all through the book of things. And he's trying to connect them and find his thread through it. And then he did the script. I don't know how long it took him, but he did a script and sent it to me, and it was really gorgeous. It was this gorgeous script that was poetic and strange and intelligent, and it didn't treat the audience like they were idiots, and it wasn't easy and funny. It was dark, and I read it and wept, and my agent read it and wept, and my wife, who's in the business, read it and wept. And my wife said, it's amazing. Paul really did it. Like, Hollywood will never make this movie. And she was right. They like 4 years later, had gone through 2 studios and all these. I hope there's no junior executives in here, but somebody had really messed with the script. Like they had really sort of like oh, some of the junior executives leaving. They'd really just messed with the script. It became really a painful object. So much so that when De Niro, was considering being in the script and we got the script, he said like, I really love your book, but the script sucks. And I had to say like, there's a better script. The first script that Paul wrote is better. And so we got that script to him, and then De Niro signed on based on the first script. It's a cautionary tale about like, I don't know, that there's compromises that get made, I think, and that's why so many bad movies get made, I think.
But that first script essentially was the one that was shot finally, wasn't it?
Well, essentially, and it wasn't bad. All the work, because it just took, that was like over 4 years. There was probably some good stuff came out of all the revisions, like that you got to incorporate it. But basically, the essential essence of the first script, I think, we sort of went back to that. It was just sort of simpler and just sort of darker and more poetic and stranger and not as comforting. I think it was an uncomfortable script, I think, and people like at the studios weren't comfortable with it. They just, there was no redemption,
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess it's time for audience questions now. How do we do this? You stand up and. Oh. Yes, please. If you have a question, put up your arm in the micro. Oh, and there's one right there.
Or in lieu of questions, you could just applaud.
So it's sort of a two-part question. I think we have a stronger sense of your father than your mother. So I'd like to know
in the film or in the book or
in this conversation.
Oh, in this conversation, okay.
So could you give us a little bit of a picture and bio of your mother, and then talk about? I mean, was this one thing that you didn't talk about was grief, and how this film allayed your grief or deepened your grief or caused you to grieve. I'd like to know about that.
Sure. About my mother, the first book, Another Bullshit Night in Sex City, is really about me and my father. I mean, that's the thing. My mother is in the book as because it was necessary to have her in the book. The second book, The Ticking is the Bomb, is more her book. It's more like really about her and her. Yeah. It's really like that. That sort of like is where that is sort of examined. Making the film, Paul said, Julianne was only in the film, and I'm sort of answering your question, but maybe not. But this is the way I'll try to answer it. We had Julianne for 4 days. It was like a 40-day shoot, 7-week shoot, and yet to me, and I think Paul thinks so too, that it feels like she's in every scene. Like that she's like her spirit permeates every scene. The mother is the force that animates the father and the son. Like that's the reason that they want to get together. They want to figure out about her in some way. Which I don't know if I would have articulated that before Paul had written the script and before we had sort of like done that. But when he said it, it made sense. Like that is sort of a reason, like probably the only reason that my father and I were sort of circling around each other, to sort of answer some, or to try to answer some questions about that. As far as that it's interesting that in the film you don't see her that much, but she's somehow in every scene. And I think you sort of get that from the film. As far as grief goes, the book, like Another Bullshit Night in Sex City, like I really actually judiciously attempt not to name my emotional state. And I do that on purpose. It's almost for that Brechtian thing. Because I do feel when I read other memoirs, once the emotion is named, and it's so limiting too. It's like, what do you say? I was sad. Once you even say that, I think it limits the reader's participation in the making meaning. Because I think the reader should have their own feeling. I think if you present a scene well enough, the reader might laugh at it, might think like, that was funny. Another reader might say, oh, that was tragic. Or another reader might say, that was bizarre. And I think that's actually a better experience rather than sort of like nailing it down to one emotion for me. But about the grief, though, I mean, this book does talk about the mirrored box as a way of sort of processing grief. And just sort of almost in the scientific way, the sort of neurological way. Which I kind of think that the film, for me, kind of worked as a mirrored box. Like I feel like that this holiday season, my mother died, around Christmas, and this Christmas, which is sort of the first Christmas since the movies come out and since it's all sort of everything's behind us, was remarkably pain-free. So perhaps, perhaps Bird Box works. So, if people are suffering from grief, or some unprocessed grief, just all you need to do is get a film made. So, really, I'm thinking of doing like a self-help book, like just,
Yeah, because filmmaking doesn't cause
deal with grief.
It doesn't cause any grief. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was the question over here somewhere? Or? Oh, right here. No, right here, and then we'll come to you. I'm sorry.
You wrote about in The Ticking is the Bomb. You wrote about being in Rome with the manuscript of Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, sort of spread all over the floor, and wrestling with that structure.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much you wrestled the same way with The Ticking is the Bomb, and how you knew that you got that structure right when you were done wrestling with it.
At a certain point with The Ticking is the Bomb, the first book, I'm interested in the structure. I think the three books have very different structures. The first one is almost a classic, like Aristotelian structure. It's like a journey. Like you get on the train at the beginning, you're in the homeless shelter. I'm in the homeless shelter. The father appears. A crisis happens. It's a real sort of classic, and then there's a resolution at the end of some sort. Yet it's broken. It's fragmented. I sort of break it up at various points. But the Ticking is the Bomb. The structure of it is very much. I felt like it was what I think of as a closed image system. There's like a handful of images that get repeated. And it's almost like this ball of energy gets created with the images on the outside of the ball. Then you sort of follow a thread from each image to some central core, which is actually a mystery at the center, which never gets solved really. So the images on the outside of it are, say, of photographs, or of monkeys, or of swimming, or of there's this whole little cluster of images that sort of keep getting repeated like over and over again through the course of the book. So that's the structure of that one. Is this? So it's a much more more challenging book because it's not like getting on a train, which you have the sense you can get off of at any time. This is you have to like move to the planet, and like you have to commit to being on the planet. And sometimes I think it's maybe a little harder to commit to that one because you can't get off the planet.
And you sort of blend both those together a bit in reenactments. There's a bit of both of those.
Yeah, because there's the course of the book, the course of the movie is going through. Yeah. But I also think this is like a triptych. It's 3 panels, like the 3 panels get, But it's using those two, but I think primarily it's a triptych.
Sorry about that interruption.
Okay.
My question's about voice, although that discussion of structure was really interesting. Are you aware of any evolution in your literary voice, or looking back, were there any decisions or discoveries that occurred from the time you started writing that gave you a sense of either arriving at the voice you want, or do you feel there are other voices you'd like to try sometime?
I don't think about voice very much. It's one of those things. I think it's like, I like a certain level of self-consciousness in that I'm writing something. But the voice is like, it feels very delicate in some way. So the more you think about it, the more self-conscious you're going to be about it. You're going to sort of not be able to speak or something. So I kind of like, whenever I'm writing, I read every page like out loud, every line out loud a lot in my head just to get the rhythm of it, to get the syntax of it right, to get the cadence of it right. I'm more interested in like cadence and syntax and like inner music to it. But voice suggests a certain like tone. I think a tonal thing for me. Like, and I like the tonal things to actually shift, which is what poetry does really well. Like it can shift from line to line, and I'm more interested in that. So it's not like a unified voice. It's really just tonal shifts throughout the whole book. So I just think of it in a different way.
It's funny you say that because you basically almost, and even in this, you're always playing with at least 2 things at once. You like that sort of contrapuntal thing in musical terms, don't you?
Yeah. And I think it's I'm always looking for the tension, like in each line. That's more what I'm interested in, is like how to find the tension, how to release the tension. I was talking to students at USC today about that, about how, like, if I'm writing a passage that's seemingly about a benign event, sometimes I will place, and it's not even maybe consciously, but I'll put in like hard consonant sounds within that, a lot of hard consonant sounds in it. So when you're reading it, it's seemingly there's nothing wrong happening, yet there's a tension because of the sound of it. Or if you're writing about something that's really difficult, you make it very, so you use like more Romance, language rather than Latinate language. And you make it sort of more rhythmic and so that it has a sort of music to it, yet you're talking about something very difficult. And that'll create a tension in that. So those are some of the things I think about. And it's not like the voice, I think, is a different thing that I don't, voice suggests like that a writer has a voice. And I think a writer has like many voices. So, that's the ones I like.
Go in the back. Did you have a question? I'm sorry, because well, you were saying that what you made me think of was that, I mean, in Taking the Bomb, I don't really get that sense of release of tension at all. We kind of get that to some extent in Suck City, but not in Taking the Bomb.
No release of tension.
Yeah.
Where it just tense throughout, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it is kind of like that, you know?
Yeah. So, yeah, I wrote that kind of with gritted teeth, so. Yeah.
Well, we feel that though.
Yeah,
There's a real sort of sense of being balled up as you're reading it.
Yeah.
And was that always the intention for Taking Us a Bomb, or did you?
No. I probably shouldn't have done that. Yeah.
I hope somebody's writing all this stuff down. Yeah, there's a question here.
Well, you wrote 3 memoirs, and yet it seems to me you're not particularly narcissistic or egocentric. I was wondering how you think in relation to your own ego, id, super id, if you have one or if you think about it.
If I have an ego?
How you relate to it if you do think about that.
Well, I think, I mean, that's the thing with memoir. I mean, that's sort of the tension, the great tension of writing memoir. That's one of the reasons I call them memoirs, is because it's such a bastardized genre. It's like, and the pitfalls are so great to just like write totally self-involved, something that's totally self-involved. So the only way to create attention is to try to, dissolve the ego as much as possible. That said, I'm completely narcissistic and completely full of myself. And in my notebooks, I just let that rip, But then, like, when I go to like publish something, I try to come off as some sort of Buddha self. But so that's a fiction that's created. Obviously, I'm my father's son. I mean, I'm probably just as narcissistic. It's just I recognize the ugliness of it and try to sort of like, temper it in some way.
And you sort of play with a couple of the kind of traps of memoirs by mentioning a couple of memoirists in this book.
Oh, I mentioned a couple in here. Yes, I do. A couple of them. Well, but they've already been beaten up, those memoirs.
That's why I'm not mentioning anything.
Yeah. They've already been caught, and their books have been pulped or sold millions. Yes.
And or both.
Yes, yes.
One thing I want to ask before as we close here, what happens with the movie is finally God, who's who said this? Wasn't really, but no. Orwell talks about that sort of sense of being in this century and nothing will ever go away ever again.
Who says that?
It's Orwell.
Orwell, okay.
And the movies, especially if you get cable, they never go away. So at some point you're going to be in a hotel or at somebody's house, and Being Flynn will be on in the background. I mean, your life has now become kind of the cultural muzak of America. In that sense, it's always going to be around. How do you feel about that?
and this is how we're going to end?
This is a question
of the term cultural muzak? Oh my God.
No. I don't. First of all, I don't think music is a bad thing.
Yeah, on you it looks good.
I can wear anything. But it's a question of legacy. It's going to be there. It's always going to be, and you won't be able to escape it.
I mean, you can always shut the TV off, right? I mean, I guess if you're in an elevator, you can't shut the music off.
I'm saying that if you're going to be in a hotel room, you'll be in a bar somewhere, and it'll be on the TV. I mean, it will, at some point, it'll show up, because I've had this conversation with people before.
Yeah.
When they talk about how this movie that they made, and you realize at certain points it's always going to be around. You get pulled back into that moment of your life.
But it's the same with a book, though, too. I mean, you write a book, and it's out there for, hopefully people will find it and read it, and you sort of want that to happen. I mean, it's not like, I don't, I think Paul did a great job. I think Paul and Joan did a great job. We have the editor right here. The editor's right here. Yeah.
Now you can find them.
Yeah. And I think they did a really great job in the film. And I'm happy that it's out in the world. Like, it's like, you know,
Because it's one of those movies when it's on that I just think I'm going to watch a minute of it, and next thing I know I watch it all the way through again.
Yeah.
Just because it does that thing you're talking about. It's allusive rather than than declamatory.
Yeah, and that was really done. Like, these guys like did that. We had all these discussions about that, like how to sort of like, you know, make the cuts. Like, there's a lot of like, they're very poetic. There's a lot of like white space within it where things aren't determined, and you end right before something is sort of said. So you don't, you know, you really have to make meaning as you go through it. I don't know. I think it's a really beautiful film.
This is a terrific book. Let's thank Nick Flynn for being here.
Elvis Mitchell.